Okay, hopefully that works. You hear me okay? Glad you all were able to float in here tonight. Seems that way, huh? The roads had so much water on them. But, you know, that rain's a blessing, and it has been dry for some time, so it's good that we get some water. Probably was a bad time to put down a bunch of fresh seed in my soil with no erosion control. Kind of washes away. Seed tends to float and run with the water, so to speak. But anyway, it's good to be here. We're going to continue tonight in our study of Deuteronomy. As you know, just kind of briefly, we've been talking about the structure, essentially, of Deuteronomy. We spent some time on that. And also, for the last several weeks, we talked about some themes that interact in Deuteronomy. Can anybody tell me what those themes were that we talked about? There's only 3 of them. It's not hard to remember. The land, okay, there's a theme about land. There's the promise, the land, the promise of the land, and going into the land, and the part that the land plays in God's provision and His promise. What else? Okay, Yahweh. I heard that. Yeah, Yahweh. What were some things that we talked about the Yahweh theme? What about Yahweh do we see interacting in the book of Deuteronomy? Okay, Yahweh is one. Yeah, that's the Shema, right? Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. That idea of there's one God, that's part of it. What else about God? Huh? Okay. Okay, He's the lawgiver. He's the supreme. He's the one who has authority. He's the one that established the terms of His covenant relationship. That's going to be part of that. Huh? Okay, yeah, the impartiality of God. That's something that we see that goes with that theme, that idea of Yahweh. The love of Yahweh, right? The love of God is another one. Okay, what was the third one? So we had Israel, Yahweh. Oops. Kind of gave it away, didn't I? Well, obviously Israel, right? It's His people who are now ready to enter the land, and there's a lot of Deuteronomy that's attached to expectations. Those obligations that we talked about are stipulations of the covenant and what God expects from them when they go into the land. Last week I mentioned that we're going to go into essentially another element of Deuteronomy, not so much in specifically looking at verses out of the book, but another application of a characteristic of Deuteronomy. So, we talked about structure and how it's structured and how that relates to the book. We've talked about, the idea of the Ten Commandments and, the stipulations, the obligations. We've talked about the themes that run through Deuteronomy. And tonight we're going to start on a study that talks about Deuteronomy as wisdom literature. And if you remember last week I mentioned whenever we're studying a book of the Bible or when we're reading a book, even outside of the Bible, if we're reading another book, it's important that we understand the framework or the genre of the book that we're reading, and some things about the book that help us frame it in its proper context. And I think this is true for biblical literature. Whether we're reading Romans or we're reading another book, we ask ourselves, what kind of text am I reading? What is the background? Chris talks about this sometimes in his studies, understanding the context and the setting of the book that we're reading. Is this a history? Is this a narrative book? Is it talking about history? Is it describing something that way, or is it more theological? Is it presenting, concepts and ideas and things related to who God is and His character and our relationship with Him? There's things like that. So Deuteronomy is, as I said last week, is a little bit of a wild card, because if we were going to say, okay, Deuteronomy being where it is and having the content that it does, if we were to describe what genre Deuteronomy is in, what would we say, probably? What does Deuteronomy stand for? Second law? Yeah. So, when we think about Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, we have this idea of all these stipulations and rules and laws that are attached primarily with those books as God's people are getting ready to enter into the Promised Land. So we might rightfully think that this is a book of law. And it is a book of law, but it's also narrative, as we talked about before. We have this narrative description of what led up to where God's people are, and the plains of Moab, ready to go into the Promised Land. So there's a narrative element to it, and there's also some poetry. We see Moses writes part of the book of Deuteronomy in the form of a poem. So there's different elements, and we want to try to make the point that we can think of Deuteronomy not simply as a book of law, because then we'd be reading it too flatly if we're just trying to look for an application of law, but more that we look at it where it has more texture than just a collection of rules. We want to look at Deuteronomy as wisdom text and not just law text. And we're going to start talking about what that means. And what we want to try to see is why the New Testament writers use Deuteronomy so much as a source of wisdom for the church. And we want to see how Deuteronomy might launch us into meditation and not simply consultation, consulting Deuteronomy about this rule or that rule, or this law or that law, but more looking at things that we can apply to our lives in more of a deeper sense. So, as we talked about, if you remember, on one of the first nights that we started, when we looked at reasons why we should study Deuteronomy, one of the things we looked at was 2 Timothy 3:15, where Paul talks about all Scripture. 2 Timothy 3:15. I always want to say 16 because that's the one I have memorized. 2 Timothy in chapter 3 and verse 15. So Paul's writing here. Let's start in verse 14. You, however, continue in the things you have learned, speaking to Timothy, or writing to Timothy, and become convinced of, knowing from whom you have learned them, and that from childhood you have known the sacred writings, Paul refers to them as, that would be, Deuteronomy would be part of that, the sacred writings which are able to give you wisdom that leads to salvation through faith, which is in Christ Jesus. So we see from that passage that there's in a way, any scripture that we look at is going to contain some wisdom that's leading to salvation, wisdom that's leading to Christ. But there's another sense in which some books of the Bible are written about wisdom. In other words, they have in their nature the cultivation of wisdom. That's their, maybe one of their primary focuses. So when we think about that, what are some books that you would think of that are probably more oriented toward Proverbs? Yeah. I mean, just jumps right out, right? You talk about somebody who really likes to read Proverbs. What is it attractive about, what makes it interesting to read Proverbs? Why is it fun to read Proverbs? Or should I ask, is it fun? Is it more fun to read Proverbs than it is, let's say, Leviticus? Short? Okay. Short little thing. Yeah, you can. Yeah, okay. Don? Okay. Yeah. And Proverbs actually personifies wisdom, doesn't it? So, I mean, it's very obvious that, I don't even know if he's with me somewhere. Okay, yeah, I guess I better catch up. So Proverbs. Another book I think that would be maybe not as obvious is Ecclesiastes. And we're going to talk a little bit about why Ecclesiastes falls into this category as wisdom literature. And the third, like Ecclesiastes, Ecclesiastes kind of falls in there because of the ramblings of an old sage, who's tried everything and indulged in everything, and yet figured out that that's not the way you ultimately want to go. There's some in Job, right? Because Job, we're going to talk more about that tonight. Why Job might fit into this characterization of wisdom literature, and then select psalms. Obviously there are some psalms that we can look at that would be kind of have as their focus, some wisdom. And then Song of Songs, depending on interpretation. The reason for that is Song of Songs has been suggested that it's about Lady Wisdom's pursuit of the human as one potential interpretation. But we're going to focus primarily on Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job as we go through here and look at the characteristics of wisdom books. So, the first feature that we might see in wisdom literature is that it offers a choice between two ways of life. An example of that is Proverbs 9, 1 through 6. And I don't think I have these up there. Proverbs 9, 1 through 6. Do I? Oh, okay. So Chris was telling me about my animations, how I can keep my animations up to where he is. So yeah, it offers a choice between two ways of life, and this graphic came from the person that originally I went through this study with, that I expanded his material. But this idea of two ways of life. And so we're going to look at these examples. Proverbs chapter 9, verses 1 through 6. Wisdom has built her house. She has hewn out of her 7 pillars. She has prepared her food. She has mixed her wine. She has also set her table. She has sent out her maidens. She calls from the tops of the heights of the city. Whoever is naive, let him turn in here. To him who lacks understanding, she says, come, eat of my food, and drink of the wine I have mixed. Forsake your folly and live, and proceed in the way of understanding. So, presenting wisdom, as a place for those who don't understand, who lack understanding, to come and to learn and to understand. And then the offsetting part of that is in Proverbs chapter 9, verses 13 through 18. So we have the woman of wisdom. Now the woman of folly is boisterous. She is naive and knows nothing. She sits at the doorway of her house on a seat by the high places of the city, calling to those who pass by, who are making their paths straight. Whoever is naive, let him turn in here. And to him who lacks understanding, she says, stolen water is sweet, and bread eaten in secret is pleasant. But he does not know that the dead are there, that her guests are in the depths of Sheol. So, and that's something we see quite often in Proverbs, don't we? We see this idea of wisdom. We see these two paths, to follow wisdom, and what is the result of that, or folly, and a lot of, like you said, short passages or short quips that connect to that idea of a choice between two paths. So the second feature of wisdom literature is that wisdom literature grounds all wisdom in the fear of the Lord. So we're going to look at some examples of that. In Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Proverbs 3 and verse 7, do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. It will be healing to your body and refreshment to your bones. Now, when we think about the two paths there, well, a passage that pops into my mind when I read that is, another passage that talks about doing what's right in your own eyes, and its path leads to destruction, right? So, fear of the Lord and not being wise in our own eyes is going to lead to healing and refreshment to the bones, but being wise in our own eyes and following a path that leads to destruction is not based on the fear of the Lord. Proverbs chapter 9 and verse 10. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. So already we're seeing some examples out of Proverbs, these short little passages that that have this element or kind of illustrate this point. So we cannot live wisely unless we first learn to fear the Lord. I mean, that's what several passages help us understand. If we want understanding, we want wisdom, and we want to apply that to the way we live, then we first need to fear the Lord. We need to understand where the source is. When we think about wisdom, what is wisdom, right? What does it mean to be wise? And that really has as its core the idea of applying knowledge to how you act, how you behave, the decisions that you make. So that knowledge, is initiated by this idea of fear of the Lord, because we want to learn knowledge that is good and fruitful in terms of our relationship with God, but also helps us be what we need to be in this life and helps us to have a good life. Yeah, so you think of some verses that talk about patience, right? Thinking ahead of time, considering the consequences. I think about where Jesus says, talks about, the idea of counting the cost, right? Understanding, what the consequences are to our commitment as well as our decisions. Yeah, good point. Huh? Yep. Yeah, we're going to talk about that tonight. The wise and the foolish builder. Again, that idea of two paths. So Don's already touching on that connection of those two paths that we see even with Jesus in the New Testament. So in Ecclesiastes, again, following this same idea, the fear of the Lord. So we looked at some examples in Proverbs. We also see this. Again, remember, we're talking about characteristics of wisdom literature and seeing it in not only Proverbs, but seeing it also in Ecclesiastes and in Job. And then we're going to apply these same characteristics to see it in Deuteronomy, so we can see how Deuteronomy also fits into this idea of wisdom literature. So Ecclesiastes chapter 12, 9 through 14. The conclusion, and this is one we probably all remember, the conclusion, when all has been heard, is to fear God and keep his commandments, because this applies to every person, for God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. I mean, in that passage, you kind of have both, right? You have the two paths, good and evil, and you also have the fear of God and keeping his commandments, that idea of it's wise. The conclusion is, it's wise to consider this, that we need to fear God and keep his commandments. So the fear of the Lord is connected not simply to good intuition or abstract morality, but to obedience to his commands. Yeah, I haven't looked at which ones in these verses. Yeah, Dick is saying that when we see in Scripture the idea of the fear of the Lord, sometimes it's connected to this idea of reverence and respect and understanding who God is and his majesty. And other times it's connected to literal fear. I mean, fearing the one who brings wrath and judgment, and we're going to talk a little bit about that when we see the fear of the Lord and connect it to things that we see in the New Testament as well. So that's a really good point. Understanding that fear. I think about applications when we think about that concept and our fear of God and wanting to do the right thing and having that motivate us to learn what pleases him and learn what is the right thing to do is like a child with a parent, right? We think about that right now. I expect that little ones like Gideon and Gwen, a lot of times the fear is that if I do something I'm not supposed to do, mom's going to take me out and talk to me, or I'm going to get a SWAT, or I'm going to get my car taken away, so they're afraid of that. But later on, right, that develops more into a reverence, a appreciation for our parents and what they've done and how they've taught us, and respecting what they know, and that they're trying to do things for us for a good reason. So that turns more of a fear of consequence into a reverence or an appreciation for who they are. So I kind of like that application as well. So we look at Job, again, connecting with this idea of the fear of the Lord. The Lord said to Satan in the beginning of Job, right? Have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil. So, God is really complimenting Job, right? And here's telling us a characteristic of Job that he admires and that he brags about almost, right? To Satan, he says, have you considered Job? He's a blameless and upright man. He fears God and turns away from evil. So again, that element of fearing the Lord and how it's connected to wisdom. And then in Job 28:28, and to man he said, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding. So an issue that frames the book of Job is whether fearing the Lord is worth it. Right? In the middle of the book, we get a poem about where wisdom is found. Which is the verses we just read. That fear of the Lord is wisdom and depart from evil is understanding. Because remember, all through Job, they're claiming that he must have done something wrong. there's something you've done. You haven't lived right, or else you wouldn't be experiencing all this calamity and all this trouble. So why? So Job, in a ways, he uses that when he tries to present his case, right? Have I not done what you've asked me to do? Have I not tried, out of my respect and my fear for the Lord, tried to do what God has asked me to do? So again, that idea of wisdom coming from that fear of God and a desire to obey Him and to obey His commandments. So the third feature of wisdom literature is concerned with practical living, and that's, I think, one of the reasons why so many people find Proverbs interesting, because a lot of times you can read through Proverbs and you just see that immediate application, don't you, to your own life, to your own circumstances. So we're going to look at a few of those. Christian readers of the Bible are often concerned with application, right? Looking for how it directly impacts one's practical living, and that's a good thing, because we want to ask that question, right? I mean, that's a healthy desire, as we're reading the Bible, to think about how we can apply this to our own way of doing things, our own way of living. But not all of the Bible is necessarily concerned just with application, right? I mean, some of the Bible is meant to convey a timeline, is meant to convey, the fulfillment of something that God promised. We can make an application of it because we know that God is faithful to His promises, but the direct application to the way we live is maybe not part of that. But in wisdom literature, it is like that. It's relentlessly and painfully practical. So let's look at some examples. Proverbs has many examples. Chapter 10 and verse 18, he who conceals hatred has lying lips, and he who spreads slander is a fool. Well, it's not hard to apply that, right? We don't want to conceal hatred and lie and try to cover it up, and we don't want to spread slander because that would be foolish. Chapter 14 and verse 29, he who is slow to anger has great understanding, but he who is quick-tempered exalts folly. So, we can apply that very directly. We need to not be quick-tempered. We need to control our anger. We need to, try not to lash out without understanding. Chapter 15 and verse 5, a fool rejects his father's discipline, but he who regards reproof is sensible. So we need to appreciate the fact that when we're disciplined, when God disciplines us, or when when we're younger and we experience discipline from those who are older than us, that we respect, that we need to consider it as something that's meant to help us understand and to train. So an application. I don't know if it's the next one. I threw one in here just because I think it's one of my wife's favorite. 27:15, a constant dripping on a day of steady rain and a contentious woman are alike. That's pretty, especially like a day like today, yeah. Dick said, especially on a day like today. Oh, we kind of giggle about that one. That's why it's, that idea that, I'm sure there are plenty in there for men, but obviously women, you need to be considered not to be contentious because, could be like a dripping faucet. You don't want to be like a dripping faucet. Anyway, before I get into more trouble, let's go on to Ecclesiastes. Same thing in Ecclesiastes. Chapter 9, and in this passage, verses 7 through 10. Go then, eat your bread in happiness, and drink your wine with a cheerful heart, for God has already approved your works. Let your clothes be white all the time, and let not oil be lacking on your head. Enjoy life with the woman who you love all the days of your fleeting life. That's the one I picked, honey, for you. Enjoy. Let your clothes, enjoy life with the woman who you love all the days of your fleeting life, which he has given to you under the sun. For this is your reward in life. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might, for there is no activity or planning or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol where you're going. So I think there's a lot we can apply in that passage. It's an example of how it just automatically makes its connection to practical living. And then Job, let's look at some examples there. Job's friends insist his troubles spring from a practical moral infraction, right, which is what I just mentioned earlier. And then later, Job defends himself and lists a bunch of practical things that he has not done because they are foolish. So, wisdom books deal with the stuff of personal relationships, of marriage, work, food, honesty, charity, and so on. So, the next feature of wisdom literature is that it teaches wisdom from the idea of listening to someone with more experience. So wisdom is accessible, but not common sense. So we understand that we don't just, absorb wisdom out of the ether, that we learn wisdom from a source, from something that has more experience or more knowledge than we do. It's learned through intentional diligence, humility, and by paying attention to those who have more experience than us, listening to your parents, right, your elders. Proverbs, as an example, is outlined much like a father to a son. Remember, it's talking about like, my dear son, think of these things, do these things this way, heed my warnings kind of thing, a call to listen to counsel. Ecclesiastes is, as I mentioned, kind of the musings of an older sage king that's been down the road of nowhere, kind of trying to express the lessons that he's learned about and the folly of, just seeking after all your own desire and trying all the worldly things available in life. And then I don't have one on Job. So feature 5. So the fifth feature of wisdom literature is that it asserts that the purpose of wise living is to enjoy blessing. So you're automatically going to see a connection with that to Deuteronomy. And it's actually a little more complex than this, because all three books deal with this claim, whether they accept it or not. The important point is that a correlation, if not causative, if not a causative relationship between wise living and blessing is proposed. I don't know what I meant there when I wrote that. If is not a causative relationship between wise living and blessing is proposed. I don't know. I'm sorry about that. I don't know what I meant to say there. Blessing being defined as longevity, abundance, wealth, and health, right? The idea of what is blessing. So let's look at wise living. Proverbs is largely certain that wisdom produces blessing. We see in Proverbs 3, verses 13 through 18, how blessed is the man who finds wisdom and the man who gains understanding. For her profit is better than the profit of silver, and her gain better than fine gold. She is more precious than jewels, and nothing you desire compares with her. Long life is in her right hand, and in her left hand are riches and honor. Her ways are pleasant ways, and all her paths are peace. She is a tree of life to those who take hold of her, and happy are all who hold her fast. So certainly paints a beautiful picture there of the blessing that comes from wisdom and gaining understanding that's proper or correct. Ecclesiastes challenges the worth of blessing. Even if you live wisely your whole life, is kind of the question Ecclesiastes asks. Even if you live wisely your whole life, so what? You still die, right? That's really the question. So, remember Ecclesiastes. I don't know if I put it in here. The book is asking in many places whether wisdom really does produce blessing when the sage or the righteous and the fool end up side by side in the cemetery, right? Whichever way you live your life, you essentially end up in the same place. So it challenges the worth of blessing, but then again answers that question. The narrator answers that question in the book. Job challenges whether wisdom is worth anything if it doesn't produce blessing. Would it still be worth living wisely if you wound up losing everything? And I think that is something that Job, he certainly comes back around. God blesses his life, and he gains a lot again later in life after he loses everything. But the point is, I think, when God doesn't really give Job a complete answer, is that if we understand no matter what this life brings us, right, the wisdom for us is that if we live life the way we need to, the blessing comes after this life in a way that's more than we can even comprehend. So that's the feature 5. The sixth feature of wisdom literature then is that wisdom literature emphasizes the avoidance of shame. If wisdom produces blessing, then what does folly produce? Folly produces curse, a wretched existence, a life of shame. Learning wisdom is about gaining blessing and about avoiding shame. And we see that in those verses in Proverbs about the idea of the two paths, right? The folly versus the way of folly versus the way of wisdom. Proverbs chapter 11 and verse 2 says, "When pride comes, then comes dishonor, but with the humble is wisdom." So that idea of humility, not necessarily shame, this idea of avoidance of shame. The avoidance of shame is the idea of, taking the wrong action, living unwisely, and then what that results in as you suffer the consequences of that. Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 13, "He who gives an answer before he hears, it is folly and shame to him." And Proverbs 20 verse 3 says, "Keeping away from strife is an honor for a man, but any fool will quarrel." So let's look at Ecclesiastes, the idea, the same thing, the idea of avoidance of shame. And we're going to, again, connect this to Deuteronomy and then also make application in the New Testament. The Ecclesiastes, "A good name is better than a good ointment, and the day of one's death is better than the day of one's birth. It is better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting, because that is the end of every man, and the living takes it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for when a face is sad, a heart may be happy. The mind of the wise is in the house of mourning, while the mind of fools is in the house of pleasure. It is better to listen to the rebuke of a wise man than for one to listen to the song of fools." Why is the mind of the wise in the house of mourning, while the mind of fools is in the house of pleasure? What does that mean? It's kind of a difficult passage to process, isn't it? Yes, the idea of mourning is the idea of mourning life, the process of life, and the purpose of it. Right. Yeah, you think about the minds of fools being in the house of pleasure. We know if we're in the house of pleasure, that means we're basically seeking after our own desires, right? We're cultivating the flesh instead of the spirit. So a mind that is wise is in the house of mourning. You get the idea of, I think again of Nehemiah, right? There was a great mourning when they understood how they had fallen short, right, of what God had asked and what he expected. That idea of, mourning, being humble and mourning and understanding that when we fall short, it should make us sad. It should cause us to want to, seek resolution, to seek change, to seek to live our lives in a better way. I think that's part of that application. So again, it's just this idea of folly, of being light-minded and not really caring about what's right in the eyes of God, not really caring about what's beyond this life, or nothing but just having as much pleasure in this life as possible, and how that's foolishness. Job. Well, is that the one I just did, Chris? Okay, that was from Job. I'm sorry. I don't know why it said Ecclesiastes. That's Job. Is that from Job? Okay, I'll clean that up. So the seventh feature that we're going to look at that characterizes wisdom literature is that it emphasizes the humane treatment of the poor and the vulnerable. Part of what it means to live wisely is that you treat those who are vulnerable well. And there are some that refer to this as the quartet of the vulnerable. You'll see it a lot in Scripture: the widow, the fatherless, the poor, the foreigner. Right away you probably think of many passages come to mind when you think of those descriptions. The widow, the orphan, the fatherless, the poor, the foreigner, the sojourner. Wise people do not mistreat the poor because Yahweh cares for the poor, and the wise person by definition should fear Yahweh, the fear of the Lord that leads to wisdom. So there's that part of the characteristic. So treatment of the poor and the vulnerable. Proverbs chapter 14, verse 21. He who despises his neighbor's sins, okay, there we go. But happy is he who is gracious to the poor. 14:31. He who oppresses the poor taunts his maker, but he who is gracious to the needy honors him. 19:17. Just some examples again. One who is gracious to a poor man lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his good deed. Again, you can see the direct practical application of these as well. 21:13. He who shuts his ear to the cry of the poor will also cry himself and not be answered. So definitely wisdom in humane treatment of the poor and the vulnerable. Wow, I don't know what I had. In Job, chapter 31, verses 16 through 22, I have kept the poor from their desire, or have caused the eyes of the widow to... So this is Job asking the question again in his defense. If I have kept the poor from their desire, or have caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or have eaten my morsel alone, and the orphan has not shared it, but from my mouth he grew up with me as with a father, and from infancy I guided her. If I have seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or that the needy had no covering, if his loins have not thanked me, and if he has not been warmed with the fleece of my sheep, if I have lifted up my hand against the orphan, because I saw I had support in the gate, let my shoulder fall from the socket, and may my arm be broken off at the elbow. Again, Job describing, right, his character, right, how he took care of the poor, and how he took care of the orphan, and how he was ready to treat them humanely and treat them rightly, to provide covering, to provide food, to provide warmth, to provide the things that they needed. So I think that's the last one. We have 7 that we went through, 7 features of wisdom literature. So at this point, so far, any questions or comments about those 7? Does that kind of... We got 10 minutes, and we're gonna start into how those connect to Deuteronomy. Yeah. Right. Right. And that's connected, right? So fear of the Lord and keeping his commandments means you're taking care of the poor, and, because, exactly, which is wise, right? Which is, again, applying that knowledge in a way that we act it, that produces that wisdom. Anne? Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. So Anne is saying that mourning that we talked about, the idea of that mourning of the righteous could be connected to them mourning for those who are lost, mourning for those who do not have God or know God, don't have the blessings that come from having a relationship with God. I mean, I know I'm sure all of us have done that, right? Reached out to someone or know someone, and it breaks your heart when you think that somebody has not, open their heart and open their mind to the salvation that's available to them, and the opportunities they have to experience the hope that we do. Anything else, Paul?
When a man humbles himself, you look toward God to help you, and you look for searching, because you know you can't control life yourself. God have for protection. And when I humble myself, I know that I need Him to say, you offer everything to Him.
Humility, when we humble ourselves, realizing how much we need Him, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Dick is saying about the passage of Galatians, is that right? Where he says, do good unto all men, and especially those of the household of the faith. So, I mean, we want to do good to everyone, but we also, Chris talks a lot about this in his sermons and in his messages, this idea of, one of the underlying purposes of the church is that we're edifying one another. We're building each other up. We're looking out for one another. We're holding each other responsible. We're treating each other, fulfilling needs and being there for one another. We only have 5 more minutes, so I might cut it off there. What we're going to do next is, again, these 7 features of wisdom literature we just went through. We're going to see how directly they apply to the book of Deuteronomy, and we're going to see all of these elements that we just went through in the book of Deuteronomy. So again, let's just really quick. It's that the wisdom literature offers a choice between 2 ways of life. Wisdom literature is grounded in the idea of the fear of the Lord. It's concerned with practical living. We're going to see that in Deuteronomy. It teaches that wisdom comes from listening to someone with more experience, especially God, or someone with more authority. Wisdom literature emphasizes avoidance of shame and the humane treatment of the poor and the vulnerable. So we'll kind of look at examples how Deuteronomy addresses and contains all of those characteristics next week. And then we're going to look at, real quickly, again, we don't necessarily have a whole book. Sometimes there's just passages that are more wisdom literature than whole books. Can you think of a passage in the New Testament that would connect those, it has those elements in it? Maybe a section of Scripture somewhere? Huh?
Yeah.
Bingo. Sermon on the Mount. We'll talk about that next week too, because we'll see a very direct correlation between all the things that Jesus teaches. And actually, when Jesus, go back and read if you want for next week, chapters 5, 6, and 7, Sermon on the Mount. And, you know, where and think about, too, where he says, you have heard it said, but I say to you. And look at how many of those are out of the book of Deuteronomy. How many of those where he says, you've heard it said, blank, but I say to you, how many of those come out of the book of Deuteronomy? And so we'll talk about that again next week. I hope I didn't put you to sleep tonight. I know you're probably tired from all that dark rain, gray weather, but hopefully you got a long nap, and so you're doing good. We'll see you all next